Imagine you're a peasant in the 1100s France. A tournament is happening near your village. Hundreds of armored knights on war horses charge across your fields, trampling your crops. One of them chases an opponent into your home and sets it on fire to smoke him out. You and your family are inside. Nobody cares. Now imagine that 200 years later, a knight who did that could be publicly shamed and banned from competing forever. What changed? The answer is one of medieval history's most brilliant social engineering projects, and it started not with a law, not with a battle, but with a story. The medieval nobility was defined by violence. How to restrain that violence without stripping nobles of their identity, that was the great unsolved problem of the High Middle Ages. The solution, chivalry, came not from force or prohibition, but from reimagining what it meant to be a knight. To understand how we got from that burning house to the jousting field, we need to go back to a Europe where the people with all the power were also the people doing all the damage. The warrior aristocracy of high medieval Europe built its dominance on mounted combat, castle ownership, lordship, and profiting from pillage and looting. Knights were the ruling social class, and that ruling position rested entirely on violence. They raided, they burned, they took what they wanted. Violence was not a flaw of the system, it was the system. Around the year 1000 in southern France, the church launched its first major attempt to curb this destruction, the Peace and the Truce of God movement. Clerics declared certain categories of people off limits for violence: priests, peasants, women. Certain days of the week and seasons of the year became designated truces, periods when fighting was forbidden. The enforcement mechanism, religious sanctions, and the threat of saintly retribution, it didn't work. The Peace and the Truce of God established an important principle that knightly violence should have limits, but it failed to change behavior in any lasting way. The reason is instructive. It offered knights nothing but condemnation and restriction, a long list of thou shalt nots, no positive vision, no aspirational identity, nothing to replace the thrill and profit of violence. A young nobleman whose entire social standing, wealth, and sense of self come from fighting will not stop because a cleric tells him to. He needs something to fight for, not just a list of things to stop doing. This is the core insight that would eventually produce chivalry, the difference between prohibition and aspiration. Telling people what they can't do rarely works. Offering them something better to become, that has power. During the 12th century, certain clerics shifted strategy. Instead of telling knights what they couldn't do, they began arguing that the knightly capacity for violence could be channeled toward constructive ends, protect the weak instead of preying on them, defend the church instead of robbing it. This was far more potent because it offered knights a heroic identity that incorporated restraint rather than demanding the suppression of everything that made them who they were. The result was chivalry, a 12th century code of conduct for knights that fused two distinct traditions. From the older noble heroic tradition came bravery, loyalty, prowess, and generosity, the classic warrior virtues. From the church came peace, protection of the defenseless, restraint of violence, and moral improvement. The fusion created something more powerful than either source alone, a knight who fights spectacularly and protects the weak. Not one or the other, both. What distinguished chivalry from earlier heroic traditions like Beowulf was not the personal qualities, bravery, loyalty, prowess, generosity. Those were conventional heroic virtues found across many warrior cultures. The key addition was a social obligation. The chivalric knight was expected to use those qualities to protect the defenseless, clerics, peasants, widows, virgins, orphans. The ideal knight doesn't just fight well, he leaps to someone's defense gladly. Then there was courtly love, the convention that a knight should devote himself to a lady, obey her in all things, and through striving for her esteem, become morally ennobled. a better person through love, and thereby more zealous in defending the weak. Courtly love took varied forms across different romances. Some portrayed it as chaste and platonic, others as fully consummated. Some set it within marriage, others made it openly adulterous. Different authors disagreed sharply about which form was superior, a debate that produced some of the era's most memorable literature. Chivalric ideals needed a delivery mechanism, a way to reach the knights themselves. The genre that accomplished this was the chivalric romance, adventure stories featuring chivalric heroes designed for oral performance in vernacular languages. Romances first appeared around the mid-12th century, but they were not the first attempt. In the early 1100s, clerics tried courtesy books, written instructional texts dedicated to high-ranking nobles, offering practical advice about table manners. The examples are vivid. Don't stuff huge chunks of bread in your mouth. Don't speak with your mouth full. Don't stick your fingers in the mustard. Don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth. If your face itches during a meal, scratch the itch with a piece of bread, then eat the bread, because medieval dining used a communal dish, and nobody wanted the residue of your scratched face in the shared food. Courtesy books failed, and the reasons illuminate everything. First, like the Peace and Truce of God, they were lists of prohibitions. Nobody likes being lectured. Second, they were written in Latin, a language the nobility generally didn't know. Third, most nobles couldn't read any language at all. The chivalric romance solved every one of these problems. It offered thrilling adventures instead of prohibitions. It was designed for oral performance, recited aloud by a performer, not read silently from a page, and it was composed in vernacular languages, primarily Old French. Nobles listened. The genre spread rapidly after 1150, and by 1200, romances were being produced prolifically across Europe. Now that we understand the strategy behind chivalry, let's look at the people who built it. Romance authors came from diverse backgrounds, men and women, clerics and lay people. But one group was disproportionately represented, court chaplains. A court chaplain was a priest attached to a noble household, serving a specific lord, a count or a duke. Their dual position made them uniquely suited for this work. As clerics, they held the church's values, peace, restraint, protection of the weak. As members of aristocratic households, they knew the nobility intimately, their vanities, their pleasures, their idea of a good story. This allowed them to craft literature that was genuinely entertaining while quietly embedding clerical values inside noble ideals. The most famous Romance author was Chrétien de Troyes, court chaplain to the Count and Countess of Champagne. His central obsession, the tension between a knight's love of martial prowess and his devotion to a lady. Each of his major works explores this tension from a different angle. In Eric and Enid, the knight Eric becomes so enamored of his wife that he cannot leave the marital bed. He neglects his martial duties entirely. His reputation suffers. The story follows his quest to restore the proper balance between loving and fighting, courtly love within marriage, happy ending. Ivan, the knight with the lion, is the mirror image. After marrying, Ivan leaves for tournaments and becomes so consumed by martial competition that he fails to return home on time. His wife rejects him. He descends into madness, a wild savage figure roaming the woods, stripped of all civilization. He must win back her love through exemplary chivalric conduct, defending the helpless, righting wrongs. Again, love within marriage. Again, a happy ending. Then there's Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien's most famous and most deeply ambiguous work. Lancelot is in love with Guinevere, wife of King Arthur. This is not love within marriage. It is openly adulterous and fully consummated. Lancelot's devotion is extreme. At one point, he finds a single strand of Guinevere's hair caught in a comb. He is so overcome that he jabs himself in the eye with it, trying to see it more closely. Scholars have never resolved whether Chrétien intended to mock courtly love, especially its adulterous form, or whether he presented Lancelot in earnest as the ultimate chivalric hero, willing to endure anything for love. This ambiguity has arguably ensured Lancelot's enduring fame. Eric and Yvain delivered clear moral lessons and are largely forgotten. Lancelot remains a cultural icon, perhaps because we still can't decide what he means. Two other figures from this milieu deserve mention. Marie de France was the most important female romance author, also connected to the court of Champagne. She specialized in short poetic works called lays, brief narrative poems. Her stories tend toward unhappy endings, and scholars have suggested that her perspective as a woman led her to view courtly ideals more critically. Being placed on a pedestal looks different when you're the one standing on it. Andreas Capellanos, Andrew the Chaplain, took a different approach entirely. He produced a detailed instructional treatise for aspiring courtly lovers with specific guidance on how to woo women of different social ranks, middle nobility, upper nobility, lower nobility, and every permutation between them. Beautiful stories are one thing. Measuring their real-world impact requires looking at the one arena where noble violence was most visible and most measurable, the tournament. Early tournaments, first documented around 1100 in northern France, were barely distinguishable from actual warfare. Hundreds of knights divided into teams by geography fought across vast tracts of open countryside using real weapons, sharp swords and pointed lances. Safety zones existed at the edges, but between them chaos reigned. The objective, unhorse opponents take captives, hold them for ransom, seize their horses and armor. Deaths were accepted hazards. There were keepers, foot soldiers brought along specifically to beat unhorsed knights, senseless with clubs so their armor could be stripped more easily. Combatants rode through peasants' crops without a sword. Knights trapped opponents in peasant houses and set them ablaze. In 1130, a church council banned tournaments outright. Subsequent councils repeated the ban. It made no difference. By 1300, tournaments looked fundamentally different. The mass melee had given way to a new, more contained format, jousting, one-on-one combat in a confined area using blunted weapons rather than sharpened steel. Keepers, those club-wielding foot soldiers, had been eliminated entirely. The uncontrolled roaming across the countryside had ended. The tilt, a wooden railing running down the center of the jousting field, was introduced to prevent fatal head-on horse collisions. Tournaments were still dangerous. People still died. The church still condemned them. But the bloodshed had diminished significantly, and for the first time, enforceable behavioral standards governed who could compete and how they conducted themselves. Here is where chivalry's fingerprints become visible. By 1300, knights could be excluded from tournaments for violating chivalric principles, speaking badly of women in public, burning peasant houses, inflicting violence on the defenseless. The ideals promoted in romances had become enforceable social norms within the knightly community. Even more striking, after 1300, round-table tournaments appeared. Knights assumed the identities of romance characters, dressing as Arthur, Lancelot, or Yvain, and engaged in mock adventures drawn directly from the stories. Their willingness to role-play as chivalric heroes suggests they took the ideal seriously enough to perform it publicly. But the very need to exclude knights for burning homes, pillaging churches, and abusing women reveals the other side. Such behavior persisted. The chivalric ideal narrowed the gap between aspiration and reality. It never closed it. The image of the chivalric knight was precisely that, an image. But it was an image with both purpose and effect. The distance between ideal and practice appears to have narrowed over the High Middle Ages as knights internalized the code transmitted through literature. The genius of chivalry was not just its content, but its delivery. The Peace and Truce of God told knights they were bad. Courtesy books lectured them in a language they couldn't read. Chivalric romances told them thrilling stories in their own language that made them want to be better. The lesson extends beyond the Middle Ages. If you want to change behavior, don't just condemn the old. Offer a compelling vision of the new. People don't abandon identities because you tell them those identities are wrong. They abandon them when you offer a better identity to step into. Chivalry reminds us that aspirational ideals, even imperfectly realized, can reshape a culture, slowly, incompletely, but meaningfully. The gap between who we say we want to be and how we actually behave is never zero. But the act of imagining a better version of ourselves has consequences.